In the age of pilgrimage, the age of Romanesque art, we saw Europe emerge from the turn of the millennium, overjoyed that the world had not in fact ended. Towns were recovering, and energized by a plea from Pope Urban II, Western Europeans set out on a series of crusades to recapture the Holy Land from the Muslims. The Crusaders did not recapture the Holy Land for very long, but they did bring back new goods and new ideas home to Western Europe. In our next era, the Gothic art of the High Middle Ages, Western European Christendom became even more prosperous and self-confident. A major church reform movement restored monastic discipline and strengthened the papacy. Towns multiplied, and some towns, such as Paris, became genuine cities. Learning moved beyond monasteries to new urban universities that sought to reconcile Christian revelation with Greek and Roman philosophy, logic, even mathematics. A gentle, loving Virgin Mary reigned as Queen of Heaven and offered believers ready access to her Son. The final judgment still awaited all, of course, but Christianity in this new era seemed kinder, gentler, and more confident of happy endings. Let's return to our Art of the Western World video for an introduction to Gothic cathedrals and their founding theorist, Abbot Suger. So you've just seen this church in the video, but now I want you to compare the Saint-Denis floor plan with the floor plan of our required Romanesque church, Santa Foy. How is Abbot Suger's plan different? Both churches have radiating chapels, but at Saint-Denis, the walls between the radiating chapels have been removed, opening up the cathedral dramatically. In other words, let there be light. So how did they do it? How did the Gothic church designers open up those thick stone walls and render the massive compound piers that had held up Romanesque cathedrals unnecessary? How did they manage to puncture the sides of these cathedrals with walls of stained glass? The required image of our required Gothic cathedral, Chartres, gives a big hint, which I've circled to make an even bigger hint. Let's return to our church architecture expert, who will tell us more about the history of this famous church. Both of these photos, as well as the photo on the previous slide, are required images. Okay, back to the disembodied voice. I want to quickly review the technological innovations that made Gothic cathedrals possible. This is very important, and as you saw, it shows up a lot in College Board questions. In an earlier slide and on the video, you saw the flying buttress. This rather complicated slide should help you relate the flying buttress of Chartres Cathedral to the Chartres floor plan. The second innovation that made Gothic cathedrals possible was the pointed arch. These arches directed weight onto load-bearing columns at a sharp angle, allowing for taller vaulted ceilings. So where did Gothic architects get this idea? Remember that a whole lot of Christians had just been off in the Holy Land in Crusades, where they had a chance to witness some of the marvels of Islamic architecture. Of course, the Arabs took the idea from pre-Islamic Sassanid Persian architecture. Art history is all about creative borrowing. Ribbed vaults were a third innovation that permitted Gothic cathedrals to expand vertically and accommodate walls of glass. Okay, this is a very busy diagram that includes more detail than you really need to know. But I find it intriguing that these Romanesque and Gothic vaults are actually the same height, but the pointed arch and the ribbing make the Gothic arch appear higher. Note the way the arches define the individual vaults, which are organizing principles of a Gothic church like the Romanesque bays. Okay, we'll let this continue building. This is one of these crazy slides I got from another teacher, but it's in your workbook. Moving on, this nave elevation from Chartres shows how these architectural changes translated into interior changes, in particular the addition of huge stained glass windows. An elevation is essentially a vertical slice of a building, in this case a slice through the nave. And here is the scary floor plan of Chartres Cathedral, also a required work without the helpful labels. Note that the vaults not only organize and define the space, but give it a sense of rhythm. The nave is long relative to the transept. These churches were designed to hold the entire congregation of the city rather than to direct and accommodate traffic of pilgrims. The radiating chapels open out more to the apse, we saw that at Saint-Denis, and become really part of the worship space. Once again, form relates closely to religious function. Here's a screenshot of the floor plan from the Khan Academy video. I'm guessing that these are the parts you really need to know, and by now they should be familiar. The west or royal portal, another required image, predated the Great Fire. So while considered early Gothic, this portal is in some ways a transitional work between Gothic and Romanesque. Let's take a closer look at these images and hear from our genuine expert again. So, a quick review of the three tympani, which you just saw in the Khan Academy lecture and again on the video. Scholars seem to agree that this tympanum depicts the incarnation, Christ's life on earth. We see Christ's entrance into the world through his birth, his presentation in the temple, and the infant Christ on the lap of the Virgin, who is portrayed as the throne of wisdom as well as the Queen of Heaven. As our lecturer noted, this is a reference not only to the Church, but to the program of scholarship, wisdom, being developed in the great medieval universities such as the University of Paris. And you gotta love that shout out to grammar. Here's where it gets more complicated. Our world's greatest churches lecturer interprets this portal as portraying Christ's ascension and the completion of his earthly ministry, the traditional interpretation. The Khan Academy experts present a newer interpretation, which is that this tympanum portrays Christ before he assumes physical form, that is, a Christ who exists outside of time, a little bit like the Vairocana Buddha. Dr. Zucker comments on the Khan Academy website that the new interpretation is the result of one gifted art historian's research, but alas, he didn't say which interpretation or which art historian. I spent some serious and ultimately fruitless time trying to track down this scholarship. But no worries. What's important is that this is a good example of contrasting art historical interpretations, the sort of observation that could get you a complexity point on a visual contextual essay. There doesn't seem to be a lot of dispute about the central portal. We see Christ's second coming to judge the world at the end of time. But what's really interesting here is how differently the Last Judgment is portrayed in this early Gothic work than it is in earlier Romanesque tympani. Here we see the central tympanum of the royal portal at Chartres, top left, and the tympanum from the Romanesque pilgrimage church of Saint Foy, bottom right. Note, these are both pilgrimage churches. Pilgrims came to venerate Mary's tunic at Chartres just as they came to venerate the relics of Saint Foy at the church that bears her name. In both churches, too, the tympanum shows Christ judging the world. So that's the continuity part. What has changed? The Saint Foy Last Judgment is filled with images of hell and the devil. At Chartres, Christ is surrounded much less menacingly by the four evangelists represented by animals associated with each. This shift from an emphasis on Christ as the agent of hellfire and damnation as well as salvation, and to Christ as the teacher, Savior, and Lord of the world reflects a very important change in worldview and theological emphasis as Europe enters the High Middle Ages and the Gothic period. This is all about context. So, just as a summary, here is a screenshot from the Khan Academy lecture. Since the ECB tends to draw heavily on Khan Academy, I think this is the interpretation that's more likely to show up in a multiple choice question. So let's move down the image to the West Portal Jamb figures. Here, our experts seem to agree. These are representations of both spiritual and temporal power, that is, power in the world. The figures you see are almost certainly Old Testament kings and queens, but they also are also stand-ins of a sort for the French king and queen in nearby Paris. By the way, these portals were used by royalty and church hierarchy, not by commoners. We have one last image from Chartres Cathedral, the Notre Dame de la Belvedere window, shown here on the right, but I'm going to save that for my last lecture. And this, by the way, will be the image you will discuss on your unit essay test. Let's finish our exploration of this remarkable cathedral with a quick video tour of the interior. Well, you may have run out of time, but if we are only going to study one Gothic cathedral, Chartres is a great choice. Still, I hate to have our students think that every Gothic church was built in France and looked like Chartres. The College Board used to love to ask questions about the English Gothic style, which is known as Perpendicular Gothic. Gloucester Cathedral, in turn, is probably the most famous example of the Perpendicular Gothic style. To quote Wikipedia, sorry, there is less tracery or ornate stonework, so the effect is more rectilinear. See how the nave has the look of a large rectangle. The curves of high French Gothic give way to much more severe straight lines. Rectilinear in this case is, of course, a synonym for perpendicular. And actually, most of you probably are familiar with Gloucester Cathedral. You just call it Hogwarts. I've put this clip of Gloucester Cathedral images, which includes excerpts from the movies, up on Canvas. If you have time, watch it now. And here, without Harry and friends, is the delicately and ornately decorated cloister of Gloucester Cathedral with its famous fan ceiling. In my final podcast of this unit, I will offer a quick review of how Christian images evolved over the millennium we have covered in this all-too-brief unit, and I'll also cover our remaining requirements.